are villages where the sea is simply part of life. Then there are villages where people speak of the sea as though it were alive. Grey Haven belonged to the second kind. The fishermen never whistled while their boats left the harbor. Children were taught never to answer voices carried over the water after sunset. Even the oldest residents refused to build homes too close to the cliffs, claiming the ocean had a habit of reclaiming whatever overlooked it for too long. Tourists dismissed these customs as harmless superstition. They never stayed long enough to notice that every family in Grey Haven had lost someone to the sea. Not every body was ever found. The village cemetery reflected that truth. More than half the headstones marked people whose remains had never been recovered. Their graves held empty coffins, carefully buried so families would have somewhere to mourn. The names stretched back for centuries, each one ending with the same quiet inscription. Lost at sea. No one questioned it anymore. Except me. My name is Clara Ashcroft, and I had come to Grey Haven for reasons that had nothing to do with ghost stories. I was a marine archaeologist, part of a university project studying coastal erosion along England's northeastern shoreline. Winter storms had carved away nearly 20 feet of cliff over the previous decade, exposing old foundations, forgotten tunnels, and fragments of medieval settlements that had remained buried for hundreds of years. To me, the collapsing coastline was history revealing itself. To the villagers, it was something else. The first warning came before I had even unpacked my equipment. An elderly woman watched me unload survey cases from the van before asking a single question. Are you staying until winter's end? I hope so. She frowned. They all hope so. Before I could ask what she meant, she turned and disappeared into the fog. Grey Haven had only one inn, only one church, only one road leading in or out. Everything else belonged to the sea. The lighthouse stood nearly a mile from the village atop a lonely stretch of cliffs, its white paint long faded to grey beneath decades of salt and storms. It had been automated years earlier, but someone still lived in the keeper's cottage nearby. His name was Elias Mercer. Everyone in Grey Haven knew him. No one seemed to know him well. When I first met him, he was repairing a weathered fence overlooking the cliffs. He looked to be in his late 60s, broad-shouldered despite his age, with rough hands that seemed permanently stained by salt and engine oil. He nodded politely as I approached. You must be the archaeologist. I suppose news travels quickly. Not much else does. There was a dry humor in his voice, but it disappeared almost immediately. His eyes drifted toward the sea. Not casually, watchfully, as though waiting for something. You've lived here a long time? I asked. My whole life. You must know these cliffs better than anyone. I know enough to stay away from them after dark. I smiled. I'm serious. So am I. The conversation ended there. He returned to repairing the fence. I walked away with the distinct impression that he'd wanted to say more, but had decided against it. Over the following week, my team began surveying the coastline. Most of the exposed ruins were exactly what we'd expected. Collapsed stone walls, old drainage channels, fragments of pottery. Nothing remarkable. Then the storms arrived. Grey Haven disappeared beneath 3 straight days of rain and violent wind. The sea pounded the cliffs without mercy. From my room at the inn, I could hear the waves striking the rocks throughout the night. Not crashing, hammering, as though trying to break something open. On the 4th morning, the rain finally stopped. Half the village walked down to inspect the damage. Several feet of cliff had collapsed near the old cemetery. Fresh earth littered the shoreline below. Broken fencing hung over empty air. A section of the graveyard had simply fallen away. No one spoke. They only stared. The sea had exposed 3 coffins buried generations earlier. Each had burst open during the collapse. Inside, there was nothing. The villagers didn't seem surprised. They were lost at sea, someone quietly said. The coffins were never meant to hold anyone. The church organized volunteers to recover what remained before another storm arrived. I joined them mostly to document the erosion. That's when I noticed Elias. Unlike everyone else, he wasn't looking at the collapsed graves. He stood farther down the cliff, watching the shoreline. His face had gone pale. Following his gaze, I saw something caught between the rocks below. At first I assumed it was driftwood. Then it moved. Not by itself. With the tide. It was an old wooden cross. Weathered. Splintered. Still bearing traces of white paint. The waves carried it gently onto the beach before dragging it back again. Again. And again. As though refusing to let it leave. Elias turned away immediately. Without saying a word, he walked back toward the lighthouse. That evening I visited the church records, hoping to identify the damaged graves. The priest, Father Nolan, unlocked a cabinet filled with brittle ledgers dating back nearly 2 centuries. Each burial was carefully recorded. Date, name, cause of death, location of the grave. One entry caught my attention. Anna Mercer. I looked up. Elias's wife. Father Nolan nodded. Drowned 23 years ago. Was she buried in the cemetery? A strange silence settled over the room. Finally he answered. An empty coffin was. No body. The sea kept her. He closed the ledger. The Mercers never spoke about it. That night the storm returned. I couldn't sleep. The wind rattled every window in the inn. Around midnight I stepped outside. The village lay wrapped in fog. Only one light remained visible. The lighthouse. Its beams swept silently across the ocean. As I watched, I noticed another light. Much lower. Moving slowly along the cliffs beneath the lighthouse. Someone carrying a lantern. Curiosity got the better of me. Keeping well back from the cliff edge, I followed the distant glow. The wind swallowed every sound except the waves. The figure stopped beside the cemetery, knelt before a single grave, then began digging. Not frantically, carefully, methodically. The lantern illuminated the man's face for just a moment. It was Elias. I called his name. The digging stopped instantly. He looked toward me. For several long seconds neither of us spoke. Then he quietly placed the shovel on the ground, covered the disturbed earth with his hands, picked up the lantern, and walked away into the fog without saying a single word. The next morning, there was no sign anyone had dug there at all, except for one thing: fresh footprints. Not one set, 2. One pair led to the grave. The other led away from it. Toward the sea, the footprints should have vanished with the morning tide. Instead, they remained. Each print was filled with seawater that reflected the gray morning sky like tiny mirrors. They began at the grave where I'd seen Elias digging the previous night, crossed the damp grass in a perfectly straight line, continued over the cliff path, and disappeared where the rocks met the sea. There were no returning footprints, only those leading toward the water. When I mentioned them to Father Nolan, he simply glanced at the path before looking away. The ground is soft after rain, he said. People see what they expect to see. But there are 2 sets. There are many things around Grey Haven best left unmeasured. It wasn't an answer. It was a warning. Over the next few days, my survey work took me closer to the lighthouse than ever before. The latest storm had exposed a narrow fissure beneath the cliffs, just visible at low tide. At first glance it appeared to be nothing more than another sea cave, but closer inspection revealed neatly cut stone. Someone had built it, long before the lighthouse existed. I photographed the entrance and marked its location for the team. When I climbed back to the cliff, Elias was waiting. He wasn't angry. He looked defeated. You went below. I found an old tunnel. His expression tightened. The tide covers it for a reason. It could be historically significant. It isn't history. The words came out so quietly I almost missed them. It's a mistake. Before I could ask what he meant, he walked away, leaving me alone with the sound of the waves crashing below. That evening, the village lost power. The storm had damaged the lines again, leaving Grey Haven lit only by candles and oil lamps. The inn grew silent. Most of the guests retired early. Unable to sleep, I reviewed the photographs I'd taken that afternoon. One image made me pause. Inside the tunnel entrance, just beyond the reach of daylight, the camera had captured something I hadn't noticed before. Not a person. Not an animal. Marks. Long, shallow grooves carved into the stone walls. They weren't random. They looked deliberate. Like writing. The next morning, despite the tide forecast, I returned alone. The sea had retreated just enough to expose the entrance once more. Flashlight in hand, I stepped inside. The tunnel smelled of damp limestone and salt. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling. The further I walked, the quieter the world became until only my own breathing remained. After nearly 50 yards, the passage widened into a circular chamber. My flashlight swept across the walls. Every inch of stone had been carved with names. Hundreds of them. Some were so worn they could barely be read. Others looked almost fresh. Each name stood alone. No dates. No messages. Just names. I recognized several from the cemetery. People officially recorded as lost at sea. A chill ran through me. These carvings stretched back centuries. Who had made them? And why? Something crunched behind me. I spun around. Elias stood at the tunnel entrance, his lantern throwing long shadows across the chamber. I asked you not to come here. You knew about this. He nodded. My wife found it first. I stared at him. This is what happened to Anna. He looked toward the carved walls. She believed someone needed to know. And you didn't. I believed some doors stay closed for a reason. His voice cracked. I was wrong. We stood in silence. Finally, Elias walked to one section of the wall and raised his lantern. They. My flashlight followed. One name had been carved more deeply than the others. Anna Mercer. My heart sank. So she died here? No. Then why is her name here? He took a long breath. Because once your name appears. He hesitated. The sea has already chosen you. I wanted to dismiss it as grief, superstition, or guilt. But something stopped me. The stone beneath Anna's name looked newer. As if someone had touched it recently. A deep rumble echoed through the tunnel. The tide. It was coming back. Fast. We have to leave, I said. Elias didn't move. Instead, he lifted the lantern toward another section of the wall. There was something Anna noticed before I did. I followed the light. Every name had a handprint beneath it, pressed into the stone. Not carved, embedded, as though the rock had once been soft. I reached out instinctively. Elias grabbed my wrist. Don't. The urgency in his voice froze me. We're leaving. The sea rushed into the tunnel with astonishing speed. Within seconds, water surrounded our boots. We hurried back toward daylight. Behind us, something echoed through the chamber. Not footsteps, not falling rock. A sound like dozens of distant voices whispering at once. None loud enough to understand. All speaking together. The tunnel seemed to breathe. The whispers rose with the water. By the time we reached the entrance, the chamber had vanished beneath the tide. Only black water remained. That night, Elias finally told me the truth. 23 years earlier, Anna had discovered the tunnel during another violent winter. She had copied several of the names into a notebook and planned to send it to historians. The next morning, she disappeared. No struggle, no witnesses, only her boots left beside the cliff. Everyone assumed she had fallen into the sea, but Elias never believed it. I searched every tide pool. His voice was hollow, every cave. I never found her. So why bury an empty coffin? Because people needed somewhere to grieve. He looked toward the lighthouse window, where waves crashed endlessly below. And because I was afraid. Afraid of what? That if they kept searching, they'd find the tunnel. The following morning, the largest storm in decades struck Grey Haven. The cliffs shook beneath relentless waves. Church bells rang as villagers hurried inland. I drove toward the lighthouse. Elias was already standing outside, watching the sea. Without taking his eyes from the horizon, he whispered, "It's happening again." The cliff beneath the lighthouse collapsed with a roar that drowned out the wind. Rock, earth, and centuries of buried stone disappeared into the ocean. When the dust settled, the ancient chamber lay completely exposed. The tide had torn away its roof. For the first time in centuries, sunlight touched the carved names. Elias walked slowly toward the opening. I called after him. He never looked back. He stepped inside. Moments later, the sea surged forward. One enormous wave crashed into the chamber, then receded. I ran to the entrance. It was empty. Elias was gone. On the far wall, where the stone had been untouched only minutes earlier, one final name had appeared. Elias Mercer. Freshly carved. Still wet. Beside it, a new handprint. No tool marks. No dust. Just the unmistakable impression of a human hand pressed into solid stone. The official report blamed the storm. The police concluded Elias had been swept into the sea during the collapse. Grey Haven accepted the explanation. It fit the pattern. Another name. Another life. Lost at sea. Months later, while cataloging my photographs, I noticed something I had somehow missed. In every picture I had taken inside the chamber, the number of carved names was different. Not dramatically, only by one. As though the wall had been changing each time I looked away. I never returned to Grey Haven. But every winter, when storms batter the coast and the news reports another person missing at sea, I find myself thinking about that chamber beneath the cliffs. Because somewhere below the tide, there is a wall that remembers every name the ocean refuses to forget. And I sometimes wonder whether one day it will remember mine. Thanks for watching. Follow Story Hub Central for more exciting stories.